Alan, you printed up a transcript of our conversation we were having, and
Yeah.
if we can use that to orient ourselves on what we were talking about, and it had to do with, well, Manu had asked me if I had any particular insights, and I was sort of talking about not necessarily insights, but things I wanted to change about how I was approaching information, giving out information, for example, as a result of roles, in how much of the backstory I share with the players. And you had all said that it was a topic that was interesting to you and that you had been working with and maybe struggling with. And so if we want to just sort of recap where we got to in that conversation, if anyone wants to sort of restate what they were.
But before we do that, Rod, can you state more specifically what your concern or interest, specific?
So initially, what I was dealing with was that I felt I had a habit of trying to dole out information. For example, in the game we were playing, where you had this big conspiracy where the villain Sargon was using Alan's character's company to put together this big plan and this big conspiracy. And I was sort of, as he was making these detective roles, I was sort of giving him these little clues and hints as the game went on, as opposed to, for example, I could have just spilled the whole thing quite early, possibly when he, session 3 or 4, when he broke into whatever I called that fake business training course, Algol Academy. When he broke into there, if he had made a successful detective role, I don't remember if he did. If he did, I could have had him find the whole plan there, and then that whole thing would have happened. Something would have been done about that much sooner, and we would have moved into different content based on what decisions you made there. And the question is, right? So, to me, instinctively, it feels like instead of putting out these little clues for you to follow, feels like I'm trying to follow the pacing model of like TV shows, genre TV shows, where there's this like season-long arc, like, I don't know, Burn Notice or something is the first one that pops into my head, where there's a little clue here and a little clue there, and you follow it, and that sort of paces the action. But I'm not, I don't necessarily think that there's any reason in a role-playing game that we should be thinking about pacing it that way, right? If we want story and things to happen emergently, then they can happen when they happen, right? It's kind of like in a comic book. In an old style comic book, would Sargon have taken up 8 or 9 issues of the comic book, or would he have taken up 2 or 3 issues of the comic book, and then maybe later he comes back with a different spin, and it's all fine. I don't have to try to make the pacing big or epic by controlling this information that you're trying to get with these roles. And another thing too is that, and I talked to Ron about this, another pitfall of this, I think, is that when you are doling out this information like bit by bit, it kind of changes the tenor of what people feel their effective actions are, to where getting more information becomes more of an obsession. And I've been on both sides of this. It feels like when you're in this little sphere where you don't have much information, it can feel like the game is getting all the information. And I don't know if that's necessarily, like, that might be the right thing for some games, but I don't know if it's necessarily the right thing for...
What did you say? The game is what?
the game is getting all the information.
Oh, the
You know,
game is, so what we are doing is gathering the information.
right. In other words,
Yeah.
to my mind, it kind of, and this is something that I feel like I've been on the player end of, where if I feel like, we don't like the information is trickling in little clues, I'm like, well, let's get all the clues, and then we'll know what to do, as opposed to, taking action more decisively. So it's kind of, it's a two-way street. It could be, as a player, I could say, well, I don't care about getting the information. I just want to do something more decisive. But
Right.
there's a sense where there are things that people on both sides of the player GM relationship, I think, can do to get to a different place if you don't, if you're not playing Sherlock Holmes, the role-playing game, if you don't want to play Sherlock Holmes. I think there are probably things you can do on both sides of the table to get to a different place. Is this all?
Okay, so yes, yeah, and I think there's the question of pacing, but at the same time, I think there's two other things that come to my mind. One is that when one takes an action that is an information gathering action, and the roll is successful, say, it's useful to have something that's actionable, not necessarily that reveals the whole backstory, but something that is just points in a direction of something they can do. Particularly in a superhero story where we want to be doing action.
Right. Yeah, I can see that.
And the other thought I had was about information that is available from a particular location would be dependent on the nature of that location.
Yeah,
so
that's
this,
true.
This grows from the assumption that we have, for example, in Champions Now, there's this assumption that you've put some thought into what is going on off stage. And when someone goes to a particular place, there's, if not predetermined, if you haven't actually figured out exactly what's going to be there, there's implications as to how much information might be in that location.
Right.
So, as an example, in the Algol Academy, I wouldn't necessarily expect to have the whole deal revealed to me.
Right.
Unless I found some deep secret location, and I might not even,
Yeah. Right.
have found that.
Yeah, that is
So
a good point. I mean, the mansion may have been a better point of reference, but then in that game, when you stuck into the mansion, it wasn't very long after that we went to the whole big convict thing. So I don't know. Yeah, maybe my case is kind of built on hypotheticals. I don't know if anyone else has a different.
No.
John?
So yeah, I thought what you were talking about is pretty interesting, and especially that idea that, to what extent are your choices based on kind of the model from another type of medium, or another medium, so another type of story. And I think I think it gets tricky because we can easily find ourselves talking about like the pros and cons of kind of how information gathering and investigative skills kind of work. And I think that Champions Now does have a pretty good solid bedrock for how you can use all these information gathering skills, and basically, if you succeed at them, then you're acting with more advantage. You're acting with some type of ability to control the situation.
Right.
And then if you fail at them, then that means the situation is going to come at you. So it takes us out of that zone where, well, you need to make the roll to get the clue to get to the next step. It's either you're going to get to the next step with this information and be able to do something, or you're going to kind of get, hit by it. But something's going to happen. So so just talking about the pacing piece, though, I think is still pretty interesting, because it still is a completely legitimate way to play I think, Champions Now to kind of do it in bits and pieces, or to kind of do the whole dump. Kind of like, oh, you could, it could be like a whole one roll leads to this whole info dump, or it could be like, the way we play it might be, oh, you need to do the computer programming to hack into that guy's computer to get one piece, and then that gives you some some advantage of how to like get access to like the security system at someplace else to get the other thing. So we could still think about pacing it out and
Right.
still be like, using the kind of supported by the rules. And what I was noting kind of in both as a player in your game, and then in my game as a game master, was my instinct is to hold back on this type of stuff kind of in general. So
Right.
And the example I thought of recently from my game where I was kind of consciously kind of went against my instinct was this situation where one of the players was using telepathy to get to kind of read the mind of one of the bad guys to see what was going on with him, and the role the level he got was to read surface thoughts. And the situation was with this bad guy is that he knew, the bad guy has this mole in the superheroes organization, and it was not clear to me, based on what was going on at the time, whether the idea of that mole would be a surface thought and would then be readable, and then kind of would be like, oh, this character who you trusted is actually a mole. If that really felt that it felt like it could go either way. That might be a surface thought, or it might be a hidden thought, and it was really sort of a matter of completely my judgment.
Right.
Based on kind of everything that had gone on, it wasn't really clear. And I said, well, my instinct is to hold back because I really want the reveal of the mole to be like down the road or something, and have it be more dramatic than just this kind of sort of random thing where they kind of randomly are using telepathy on this guy and aren't really, and they're just sort of fishing. They don't have a really strong idea. But then I thought, well, that's my instinct, but is it based in like, is that I was like, I don't know that that's necessarily the best thing, and maybe it'd be better if I just kind of throw stuff out there and then see what happens. And so I went the other way with it this time, and it was pretty satisfying. And after I had jumped and kind of thrown that out there and said, "There's this mole," I realized, I was probably being a little bit, based on that, like you were saying, based on wanting to be like some other type of story. In my instinct to hold back, rather than just be like, let's see what happens. Let's just kind of go with the flow, give more information, give them more stuff to work with, and then see what happens.
Right.
But I don't think it's like I don't think it would have been an illegitimate choice for me to hold back.
Right.
I think it would have been supported by the rules and everything, and it might have been okay to kind of pace things a little differently. But I'm certainly in the same space as you in being kind of thinking about this and kind of consciously working through,
Right.
Trying to make kind of decisions that are true to the game and not really so much based on like, oh, what I'm hoping it'll look like.
Right.
And for me, like the pacing thing goes beyond just the kind of this. I think the investigative kind of information gathering question is a kind of a clear example of it. But even in terms of I think I mentioned in my own play in your game, there was kind of like ideas I had for the character, and I was sort of holding back because in my head, and I mentioned like, or subconsciously, I wasn't really conscious of this until after the game and we were kind of looking back at it. I had this idea of like, oh, there's going to be this character's going to have this like super long Chris Claremont style character arc, that goes on for 100 issues and like as these twists and turns, which is like, I think Champions Now says like, don't do that first of all, but also it's like in retrospect that's like not realistic or that fun it's not as fun as it could be for me and for you guys. Rather, if I had just been like, okay, I'm just going to kind of put more stuff out there and see what happens and just let it kind of play true to my character in the moment and not try to play towards like what I'm hoping will happen 4 sessions down the road, or like, oh, I'm going to save that for 4 sessions down the road. Like now I'm like, why? That doesn't make much sense. But
Right.
you know, in the moment or at the time, I was like, well, I've got this arc planned out, which is you can't do.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like the opposite of story now. It's like player-sided railroading in a way.
You had a thematic, a theme to the conflict you were interested for your character, but you were holding back on allowing us to buy into setting up situations that would let you have that experience.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was kind of a pacing thing that like my internal pacing clock was not calibrated with what was actually happening. Sorry, Manu.
No, that's okay. So I'm seeing like at least three or four different things, different questions are coming in. So one is like pacing. What does pacing exactly mean?
Right.
And secondly, how does the giving out of information influence the pacing? And third is like for each, how do the roles influence the pacing, and how for each role, how significant each role is, how does that contribute to pacing? And then there's the other question, which is whether you should have kind of information role at all, right? So those things are all sort of playing a role. So like in some games, the role is like roles vary in kind of scale, right? Like some games will have a scene resolution where you just roll for the whole. Like there's maybe a question about the whole scene. Okay, do you get into the castle, right? And there'll be one roll, and it'll decide whether you're in the castle, right? Whereas you could have finer, smaller scales where you're like, oh, okay, am I able to bribe the guard, or am I able to, or you could have a roll for like picking the lock, right? And so there'll be a number of rolls to get into the castle, and each one would be finer grained. And so all those things are I think playing a role. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so.
And one of the things with pacing is, well, I think you guys were already saying is that, I mean, if I'm the GM and I'm trying to control it too much,
right?
Am I then not doing story now? Am I doing intuitive continuity or something else instead? Right?
Well, right, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So in theory, right, pacing should be in this, in Champions Now, it should be emergent from the decisions of the characters, but it's kind of hard. Like it's a lot of.
I think there's also.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan. I think.
I think, particularly in the way Champions Now is set up, the special skills like detective role and security systems, things like that, are wide open for interpretation of how much gets done on a given role.
Right.
So I think in the case when Lone Star infiltrated the mansion, it was just one stealth roll or one security roll or something. It wasn't a blow by blow thing. And part of that, of course, is the decision to. Lone Star had the spotlight, so I was seeing a situation where I didn't want to have a long, grueling back and forth to take the spotlight away from other players.
Right.
And at the same time, how much energy do we to this particular infiltration?
Right. And that was.
It does seem like. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, and the interesting thing about that session was that I was really struggling with that issue out loud and just trying to strategize about how we would do that in the game, very candidly, which in some ways is maybe not as fun as if I had just made a decision and shared it with you. But I was really struggling with what to do in that situation. So.
Yeah, but how do we come up with a joint understanding of how these things work unless we have explicit conversation?
Right. Yeah, Manu, you were gonna say something.
Oh, I was just going to make the observation that it seems like, this might be too simplistic, but it seems like the more significant you make make roles, like every role has a lot of weight, or like a lot of story significance behind it, and how things are going to change. Then the faster the pacing, maybe. What do you think?
It could be. I mean, one thing though that's. I mean, when we say pace, I mean, is pacing. What am I trying to say? Yeah, certainly the more can happen in a session, right? But that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, because in some way how long the story ultimately is emergent. That's not telling you what the pacing is like relative to the ultimate end of the story, because you don't know where the end is yet, or you shouldn't. And so I don't know if I've gotten off track, but it's something I thought of. Well, it's something I thought of in relation to John's talk about the Claremontian story arc, where, I mean, if we think about it, at the time he was writing, well, I haven't read that deeply into how Claremont wrote his X-Men run, but I don't have the impression that he was writing 100 issues ahead, right? I think he was actually only writing however many, dozen, maybe a dozen at most.
There's an interesting documentary available on Claremont on Amazon Prime. If you have access.
Oh, okay.
And
yeah, I'll take
it talks about his writing process and interesting, but it is certainly not thinking. He wasn't thinking very far ahead when he was thinking of current drama.
Right. So in fact, the epic arc is just a result of keeping at it for a long haul, right? It's not. Mm-hmm. It's not the result of starting with here's my 100 issue mark. It's the result of just putting in the footwork day at a time.
And interestingly, that is the conflict that came up, was that he was trying to write exciting stories, and the people who, this is a time when comics were transitioning into marketing devices, and so the people from up above were pressuring him to do all these cross issue multi comic multi-title crossovers and things like that, and so there was a conflict in that. And so it goes back to what Ron writes in Champions Now about how the 60s and 70s, early 70s comics were the creator is just coming up with, what are we doing this month?
Right. Yeah. Oh, John?
So yeah, something else I was thinking of, and it gets to, I guess, Manu's question of what does even pacing mean when we're talking about this, because that's, I think, kind of interesting, or the idea that, and then this idea that pacing in a role-playing game, I think, really can be very different from, it kind of is its own thing compared to other media. And I'm thinking of my the Legendary Lives game I'm playing now, or running now, where we finished, I think, eight sessions, and each session is about 90. We're playing for about 90 minutes to 2 hours. So about 16 hours of role-playing game, and it feels like, if I think of how much it feels like, in terms of the intensity of the conflict and then the ups and downs. It feels like we've done a whole season of a TV show, but if you actually like wrote it out and like filmed the script of what we've actually kind of done, it would actually probably be like maybe a pilot episode of a TV show. So there's a sense, and it doesn't really matter. I don't mean that as a criticism of my game, which is really, I think, really exciting. But there's a sense that in Legendary Lives, and it might be partly speaking to one of Manu's other points, that like you do a lot of roles, and most of the roles have kind of do a little bit. So you tend not to have big situations that are solved by one role. Usually it's a couple different skills involved to get through any given conflict. It's usually not just one skill. There's usually a couple different ways to go at it, or characters will be going at things in different ways. So you've got a lot of these little bits of stuff that give you this big up and down feeling. So you have a really big sensation of like, wow, we've been through a lot. Right. But if it was going to be turned into like another medium, it wouldn't like fit. It doesn't kind of fit the emotional and psychological space in a way that the game does. And I mean, I don't think that's like a bad thing about it, but it's just sort of like it. I would say just on an interesting to me observation that of why it's dangerous then for us to say like if in our Champions game we're saying like, oh, we want it to be paced like a TV show, right? That might be fighting against what the game is trying to. That might be fighting against the pacing that the game is trying to give us. Trying to put it in another, try to put it in a different box or to spread it out or something isn't gonna be true to the real dynamics of the game as it's played if we just kind of let it go.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, I think I see what you're saying.
I can see where we all come in with expectations when we play a role-play game.
Right.
And at the same time, it just occurred to me that really how much we get done in a given, or how much. So if pacing is the definition of how fast something moves towards a kind of resolution, then that I think is partly a function of how the game is designed to process task, or like how much is done by a particular task resolution, but it's also partly just how we treat it. So and this shows up in Champions Now in particular because skills, like I say, detective system or security systems, computer science, that kind of thing, they're all very kind of wide open as to how long is it going to take, how much is it going to give you. Whereas when you get into combat, you're down to this, 6-segment count, and you can get this much done in this much time. And so there's that contrast between those, the kind of wide open, I guess it's connective tissue of story versus the pulse pounding moments that we're moving towards,
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to get back to, John, you mentioned that interesting issue of like sometimes you're holding back, and did that have to do with your internal sense of how you wanted the pace to be, or something else?
I think in the case of me playing in the game with you guys, I think that was kind of subconsciously based on this internal sense of pacing. Like, oh my, it's too early for me to reveal that piece of my character, so I'll hold on to it and then save it for later. And I think there is like an aesthetic choice. I don't think it's like a right and wrong. I mean, there's like there's like a dial. You can't kind of. It probably also would have been unsatisfying if I had kind of shown up and like barfed it all out.
Right.
Just in like the first scene, and then it's like, oh, that also kind of doesn't give you anywhere to go. in for the opposite reason. But then it's like, okay, you've just done it all. Where, but then my own instinct tends to be more like, oh, let's hold it back,
Right.
which was definitely on display as when I'm a player. I mean, it's my instinct too as a game master, but I'm more I game master
Yeah.
more, so I'm more conscious on kind of my game mastering skills and working on those or working on, so I feel when I'm now game mastering, I'm now able to like, oh, that instinct may be wrong, so I can calibrate it a little more.
Right. And well, you talked earlier.
But it's the same instinct in both in what that I was feeling in my Champions Now game where I'm running of like, oh, should I let them know about the mole? It's the same thing of like, oh, should I let you guys know about what's going on in my character's head?
Right.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about. I can't remember the satyr's name, but Daenerys, right? And
Yeah,
Brian
Daenerys.
was the
dude.
secret ID. Yeah. Thinking about that, Champions Now in particular gives us tools to set up these thematic conflicts. So you can identify dependent NPCs and give them situations, cyclims, things like that put pressure on the issue that you want to explore. And likewise, the same thing with villains, if you specify that. And in other games, it's less mechanical. In a game like Primetime Adventures, you have like an explicit issue, and people come up, and maybe even a nemesis and things like that. So you have the player kind of puts things into place, and I think it's valuable to have a conversation. If you don't feel that you've been able to project it with the mechanics that the game requires, it's valuable to at least let the GM knows what kind of conflicts you're looking for.
Yeah.
So, and then it comes out as a show me, don't tell me kind of thing. Whereas we can say, oh, Daenerys or Brian's having this issue. We can see it happening.
Right.
So yeah.
And I think I hit it I think I was into the groove in the last couple of sessions. I was especially enjoyed his last conversation with Harry, for example.
Yeah.
But I wish I could have gotten to that kind of comfort level with that earlier.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, earlier you had used the phrase, you had said something that you didn't think holding back, both pushing forward and holding back would have been legitimate, or holding back isn't illegitimate. And I don't think, it's not really about legitimacy, right, so much as about aesthetics in a way.
Yeah.
Like it's an aesthetic choice. But for me, the thing is that you have to, in order for the choice to be there, you have to have the capability or the facility of picking either one. Like if you have a habit of holding back all the time, then you don't know the choice is there, and that's a problem. So you have to have done it both ways before you can make the choice, be capable of making the choice of which way to do it, I think is. And so for me, it's a question of practice. It's like a musician practicing, right? You have to have the tools available to you to be able to use them. And so that's what I'm trying to develop in my own playing. I'm game mastering here. Who was gonna?
So, sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking about Troll Babe in relation to some of these issues, and one of the interesting things about Troll Babe's resolution system is how, I think, and you all have played that, right? Or at least read it, I think, is how you can decide, like when a conflict happens, you can decide, you kind of decide together how significant each role is going to be, right? So you can decide, okay, it's only going to take one success, right? Or at the other end, I think is 3, right? So you have this, there's and the question is, it seems like when the scene is particularly important to you as a player, that you often will want to go more towards the higher end, right? You want to have more roles, and uh, and the question is why? And so is that because in some sense each role is less significant or powerful, right? But
Yeah.
there's more. If you have more roles, there's more detail that you get into in the scene.
Right.
And so, if you're particularly interested in what's happening, maybe you want to see more of that detail, more of and more opportunity for drama.
Right.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is sort of the dynamic in terms of Troll Babe. When I was running it, there were times when we just sort of played with the knobs and made conflicts higher or lower, and so we could sort of see when we made a conflict higher, but it kind of didn't. Like, there's one that's actually online where I've got a 3 out of 5 conflict that I with Robbie's daughter, where she's escaping from this underwater sea king, which felt like we both wanted to put it at the 3 out of 5 because it felt big and dramatic. But in fact, in the middle of that conflict, I was like making up new creatures to attack her, as if I had sort of run out of the content that was there in the original content. So it's not necessarily. So it actually wasn't necessarily a good 3 out of 5, right? Because the groundwork wasn't. It was at a dramatic moment, but sometimes it's equally dramatic at the dramatic moment. It's like in a Japanese samurai movie, where the final duel is them staring at each other, and then, the guy kills him in one stroke. That could be the dramatic moment. What I think makes the difference is when there's a lot of. What am I trying to say? Balls in the air. There's a lot of maybe different
in the
content
that you want to explore.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's maybe when the 3 out of 5 is really good, or if it's, or if there's a lot of investment in, like if the Troll Babe player really hates this particular character's guts, and really wants to make a show out of kicking his ass, drag it out. That could be but that's in that case it's emotional investment in.
There's a psychological effect. There's a psychological effect of how many moments uncertainty we experience.
Right.
Makes it feel more significant.
Right.
So when you're doing the 3 out of 5 contest, it feels like more happened, even though it's in smaller detail. And you can see it in action movies where they break out into blow-by-blow combat, right? Mm-hmm. It all of a sudden feels like a hell of a lot happened when by the time the combat's over, like 3 minutes have passed.
Right.
In the fictional reality. But there's also a downside to that kind of busy work. And I think I run into it in Apocalypse World games, where every role doesn't necessarily decide everything.
Right.
And then you end up with lots of 7 through 9s that introduce something else into the system, and so it seems to be chasing things around, and it feels like there's a lot that happens, but doesn't necessarily go.
Yeah,
is that a
satisfying resolution?
Is that a special problem with that 7 through 9 thing, though?
I suspect so.
I kind of feel the same way, and I had a friend who used the exact same phrasing. It feels like a lot's happening and we're not going anywhere. At least that's how I feel about it. So.
Yes, I think one of the big issues about the pacing stuff is that there's two places it can show breakdown in how quickly a particular conflict gets resolved. So it's how much we're zooming in to look at the blow by blow, or how many details go into resolving it. And then you've got this step back on pacing, whereas if the game, so in these games where we do things like set up an existing backstory as a GM, and part of the tension is what the bad guys in the story are doing behind the scenes and what their motivation, that there's an element of all that work is putting pressure on the players that makes them feel like they're going to resolve something. And so how much do you give of that big stuff to get to the resolution? So you've got the small breakdown for like quick actions, and then you've got the big overall, how fast should we go towards resolving the big backstory.
Well, I mean, I'm wondering if we can generalize from the how many roles um, principle, which is, maybe the pacing, to the extent we control it, or that we ought to control it, is determined by how much of what is going on is interesting and that we want to explore. So, for example, if let's say the player characters have to cross a wilderness to get to the haunted castle or whatever it is. Right? If the wilderness is interesting, right? If you have some interesting locations with some an enclave of creatures with an interesting culture, and we might have some interesting problem over there, and then there's another village over here with a monster terrorizing them, and so on. Then you might want to take that journey through the wilderness. You might spend time on it. I mean, it's a lot of it will be up to what the players find interesting and want to do, right? But if the wilderness is just boring, then you can just skip the whole thing and frame the next scene at the castle, right? So that's one thought I did, which is the pacing is determined by what the group finds interesting.
Yeah.
Well, go on.
Well, right, or what's relevant to their right? What's relevant to what they've expressed? Yes, interest in, or what they're driving towards. Yeah, but
I'm thinking it's not just necessarily about what's interesting, but it's about what they've established about their characters and the characters' objectives that would be relevant.
Yeah.
Because if you just go with what's interesting, it's you've got all of a sudden we're interested in what's over here in this glen over here. It's got nothing to do with how my character is struggling to deal with these feelings about this, or how we're on our trip to take the ring to Khazad-dûm or whatever. It becomes, let's go into this mine over here, And that works fine when you're just doing it like a dungeon crawl, where the idea is to just find a dungeon and go in, and I mean that is the purpose. But if your players have set up a desire to work on certain,
right,
then interesting is, I think,
it's too vague.
Too vague, yeah.
And even in that situation, even if when you're driving towards goals, there can be, even characters who are driving towards goals in books, movies, whatever, take rests or have interludes. So, but if you have the idea that stopping to look at stopping to do this side thing is an interlude to the main goal we're driving to, then you're still sort of going towards the fundamental character. The fundamental character.
I think
things.
my ideal my ideal of like side quests or side interactions, stopping at the tavern to talk to somebody, my ideal would be that the interaction would have something to do with explicating something about the character that's interesting.
Right.
That
Like,
makes sense.
Like, there's this scene where I cannot remember her name, the Stark girl with the Hound.
Arya?
Arya, thank you. Arya and the Hound are in a tavern. Can't remember exactly. Arya's like incognito in a tavern, and it's all about interacting with how she responds and learns from that situation.
right.
So, and that didn't have anything to do with the growing process, but it wasn't related to the direct storyline at the time.
Right.
Not that we have, I mean, I'm talking a lot about how I see things from a story standpoint, but I don't want us to get stuck, or I don't want to suggest that the viewer, for example, should get stuck in this idea that they have to channel everything down what they see as a storyline.
Right. John, you look like you're.
Yeah. So this is. I don't. This may be a little bit of a tangent, or maybe just a kind of a reframing, and I wonder if part of what we're talking about is also, in terms of pacing, has to do with just the getting some mastery over bang delivery. So we want to be as like a game master, you want to be, or in this type of game, in a lot of these type of games, you want to be delivering bangs, and you want to be making sure they're happening with enough regularity that the players are always sort of reacting to something or resolving something. You don't want to make the bangs kind of the holding back danger is the bangs are either too small to actually really be bangs, or they're kind of not, you're not kind of giving them enough to really resolve or react to. So it sort of gets to that little that sense of that you're getting that information doled out without real actionable issues. And then on the other side of things, if kind of everything's a bang or everything's just super consequential, then you also don't have time for the players to actually react or resolve one before they're sort of hit with another thing. And I wonder even if in that, kind of Manu's example of the trip through the forest, that if you're you could say like, well, we just can cut through it to where they have to go, but if you have an encounter on the way that's a real bang, like that's a real like, oh, you can't actually ignore it type situation, like, okay, it's like some situation where you're caught between making some type of kind of relevant choice for that game, and it might be a resource management choice if we're thinking of a dungeon crawl, but it might be like a choice of like, oh, putting one value of a character against competing values. Then it's a completely, I think, legitimate kind of choice to like throw that encounter on the way through the forest. But I do think it kind of becomes again, I'm using legitimate maybe, but just to mean like to get back to the thing, it's sort of an aesthetic choice. Like you can say like, okay, this is going to be the game, and we know this is a game where we're going to have a lot of little interactions kind of pulling our attention away from the big kind of quest or whatever, or we can say we're kind of moving right through it, and kind of hit those marks. And I think it does. I don't know, I guess I think it kind of does. I'm kind of I find myself agreeing with Manu's kind of point that there is that parallel between the whether we resolve it all in one role or resolve it in multiple roles, that we can we can. It's not that there's one right or wrong way, but it's that scaling things, and each table maybe will have a different. Each table for each game might come to a specific sense of like how we do it or what's the right pace for us. But just knowing that like the extremes of pacing are probably dangerous, and then also, again, that idea that if we're spend too much time thinking about like how other media would do it, it can be a trap as well. I don't know if that's more confusing.
No,
it makes sense to me.
All right.
Another thing that it brings up for me is the idea of you're talking about the GM bringing things, and I wanted so it brought up the question for me: are the players responsible for initiating?
I think that's a good point. Yeah, like the players
You've
have
got an imaginary landscape with imaginary things and people in it, and players can declare, "I'm going here," I'm doing this.
Yeah, and in fact, I agree. Sorry to interrupt. No, I think you're right. I'm looking at a little bit the GM centric, but I think you're right that the players can, the player control of pacing or pacing is really much more shared pacing is really, I think, probably much more like one of these like shared things at the table, and even if players wouldn't say like, oh, I'm not in charge of the pacing, that's the GM's job, they're probably doing things that are actually contributing to like how things are going.
Right.
For sure.
There's a chronic difficulty with, particularly if you've come out of railroading experiences, of sitting back and expecting to be reactive all the time. So they don't actually initiate things. And this is for me personally one of the most frustrating things as a GM. It's like, if I,
yeah, I mean, you're
making me,
Yeah, no.
You cut out there for a second, Alan. Did you say that again?
I was just saying, why don't I find myself working with some players and going, well, why don't you do something instead of waiting for me to give you something to react to?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is difficult, especially if you're like when you're coming out of that kind of thing. Frequently, you don't even know. Like, in order to have an active character, it has to start with your conception of the character and character creation frequently, or maybe it doesn't have to, but frequently it does. Like in Champions now, it's supposed to start with your conception of the character as you create them, and it's difficult to take those steps a lot of times. I think if you're coming from a traditionalist, I don't know if traditionalist is a real thing, but from a role playing culture where you're kind of expected to follow the game master's lead.
Yeah, and it also strikes me that this brings up another thought for me, is that we have to, because this is a spontaneous activity, we can't, pre-plan. We don't want to pre-plan everything.
Right.
Both the GM and the player have to rely on momentary inspiration.
Yeah.
So from the player's standpoint, it's often, I don't yet know my character very well, but let's see what develops if I do this.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in the Legendary Lives game I'm playing, the player who's playing this character, Field Mouse, he told me he made a decision to be much more proactive than he usually has when he plays role playing games, and so his character's kind of making these pretty big, bold choices, and it's really propelled the things along in a way that if he was, I think, not consciously trying to do that, it would have completely changed the whole game and the pacing of the game too. So yeah, players you can definitely have a major impact.
Yeah, one thing that occurs to me on that note when I was talking to Ron about this whole D&D thing, or the players who, sort of go into this D&D mode, is that part of that mode is feeling like you're there to, if you feel like you're there to do the adventure or solve the mission, then like you seek consensus with the other players about what the right way to do the adventure is, and then if you make bold choices or go off on your own, you're the asshole, like, who's not doing it right. So, like, coming from that mindset, coming from that mindset makes it hard to break out into this other thing. In other words, in order for things to happen like they're happening in John's Legendary Lives game, we all have to understand that we're here to, like, create this piece of fiction about these different characters with their different attitudes, and we're not necessarily always gonna seek consensus with each other about what the right thing to do is, right?
Yeah.
Well, and that comes a little bit from, well, not a little bit. I mean, the long history of role-playing games punishing people for taking innovative action, or taking risks, or the old. I mean, it starts back with, like, what we call it, the Temple of Ultimate Evil or something like that, where all you had to do was step through the wrong portal and you disintegrated out of the game. And there was no indication of whether you should or not on the outside.
Right.
Random stupid death is the
random stupid death is a bane, and people still, there's a certain amount of, still a lot of role-playing games, you lose agency as a player the moment your character's out of play, knocked out, unconscious, dead, whatever. You lose agency, and so I think we're taught to be cautious. It conditions us to be cautious.
Yeah.
When even if you're playing a game where you can end up dead and out of play for a while, it's more rewarding, I think, to be less cautious, or at least less mindful of that element, and more engaged with being a hero or pushing what your character would do or something like that.
Right.
And then we have games like Champions Now, which is incredibly forgiving, unless you're suffering enormous amounts of body damage or destructive body damage.
Right.
There's no way to take a character out of the game permanently.
Right.
I mean, even if you do get your body knocked down to death levels, it's player character decision or player decisions.
Right.
And so it's empowering. I got to say, when I was in the game Rod was running, I was experimenting with pushing to the point where my character passed out, and it was both very risky and at the same time felt very, very true to the genre and very heroic. It was thrilling for him,
Good.
So that, I guess, I'm talking about a safety net in this case.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. Well, it's a safety net with teeth, or there's teeth there too, because because taking yourself out can have real consequences to the story. I mean, you can look like a real zero, and that can change all sorts of things. And but it doesn't mean you got to, like, sit out the game or, like, write up spend 2 hours making a new character or something like that.
Right.
So it kind of makes even getting taken out and losing, it gives you more stuff to work with, and it's more fun in a way.
Right. I mean, because you're not as
problems to work with.
You're not as invested in whether you win or lose as in the destiny of your character, and so looking like a zero could be a fun part of that journey
for a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm realizing for a minute I may have taken our discussion off track. Does what we were just talking about have to do with pacing information and what's the other, holding back on the progress of information, I guess.
I think it's maybe if we think of, like, holding back in general, maybe not. I mean, because you're talking about not holding back in terms of going kind of all out, But so I don't know. I think it fits.
Yeah, I think just learning to not hold back has been a big, theme of this. I think in terms of information, that does sort of get subsumed into the overall holding back topic. I do still feel that I'm onto something about this idea of what was it? Oh, well, so of the thing about the game turning into getting the information.
Yeah.
Ron, when we were talking, called it first person shooter mode when all you know about is sort of what's around your character or what's in your character's field of operation.
I think I've heard it called pixel hunting or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
to go around this screen and reveal each pixel before you know what's going on.
Right. But so that's where I was. That's where I'm thinking. That's where I was getting with information. Different techniques for sharing and exposing information could potentially break that habit if you're dealing with people who have it. That's where the thing I was talking about with, what I wanted to do in my next Champions Now game was anytime an NPC, made a roll for something, that something was on the screen.
Right.
So the players are seeing more context, and are not just necessarily they don't necessarily have to feel like they need to enlarge their character's sphere of knowledge in order to get actionable information, because their own understanding can, of a bigger context can feed into what they think their character would be doing.
I understand that. I'm thinking about one or two sessions that I ran for Champions Now in Seattle with Rod and Bill and Robbie, and there was at least one whole session where we spent time going around gathering information.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think I was struggling with the same issue during that, is because where I was standing was that I knew there was a bunch of stuff that was going on in the background, and I knew that there were places and things that the players could do to get that information or get more information, and you guys weren't going those directions.
Yeah, we.
Well, was there
go on.
No, I was just going to ask, was their process of trying to find the information, was it fun and fulfilling, or was it frustrating?
You'll have to ask.
There were definitely times when it got frustrating in those sessions. I think that's probably around then is where I was making the decision to give my character the awareness power, right? Although that, sorry, there was just one. Even then, though, there was one situation, and this goes back to the D&D mode stuff I was talking about. One of the last, maybe the last session or the second to last session, there was this whole deal where we knew there was a hostage inside this house, and Robbie's character was sneaking inside around the house and looking in one window after another to try to see if he could see the hostage.
Uh-huh.
And this whole time, me and Bill's character were lurking. These sort of godlike superheroes were lurking behind a berm with our eyes peeping up over. My character could have just fucking summoned the water spout and had a bunch of birds fly around the house and look in all the windows. And for some reason, I didn't
use your awareness power.
Yeah,
you didn't think of it.
I didn't think of it because I was so locked into this mode of sneak into the house. Robbie's gonna sneak around the house. That's where I sort of came up with this idea that there's something about squad break. Anytime there's a kind of squad break-in scenario, it turns into this D&D Vietnam kick in the door
Well,
throw the grenades.
there was in that element there was a chance to give Robbie's character a spotlight so he could go and do his thing.
I guess that's true. I didn't think of that.
Mariner's awareness power was more suited to
big
looking
picture
around.
type. Yeah.
Which actually would have revealed something else. There was a sniper hiding in one of the locations that nobody spotted.
Right.
Until he started shooting, and that would have made a difference. But as far as letting what was his name, letting the Spur go in and use his sneaky power to go and look through all the windows to see what's going on. I think that's a fair spotlight and use of character abilities.
Yeah.
So,
I guess I could see that.
So I'm wondering, in general, should it be that we just, why, maybe we should just give the players information, unless the process that they'll go through to find out the information is going to be enjoyable for everybody.
But how do we know it's going to be enjoyable?
Well, yeah, you have to.
There's that, but
you have to make your best judgment. And also, when you make a role, an information-based role, I think maybe could it be that the only reason somebody should have to roll for information is that if they fail, then there's going to be some. It won't
a different.
They fail to get the information.
You'll have a different positioning,
action.
A different positioning going into the next combat, and that's something that Alan was talking about, and actually that your information rolls, and I think this is explicit in Champions now in the text, is that your information rolls should feed into whatever the next, your positioning and whatever the next kind of big thing for your characters to do is, and I can. I can imagine that in terms of, what I was doing in my game. If you would, like Alan, you talked about an idea that those roles could be used to set up a conflict. Okay, wait. So, let's say I'm running my game. I know that Sargon has this big plan to summon Ares and blah, blah, blah. And I look at my now and I decide like session 3, he's going to do it now. He's got everything set up. There's really no reason he would wait. In terms of what I was doing in my game, I kind of just I wasn't really using the now very well in that terms. But anyway, so in this scenario, I decide in session 3 he's going to do the now. He's going to do this session. I ask y'all what y'all are doing, what your general characters are doing over the next couple of days, and Alan says he's going to try to find information about Sargon or about this conspiracy, and so he makes his detective work roll. If he I've already decided as my backstory that this big, summoning is going to happen. If he succeeds at the detective work roll, then he knows in advance, or he positions himself so he can be positioned in a good situation to intercept or interrupt, possibly before it's actually underway. If he fails, then it starts before he can do anything, and that's probably, arguably, what I should have done in session 8. Session 8, right? But
I was actually okay or I would have been okay if the detective work role had succeeded, but only put us in a position of it's ongoing and now we've got to do something about it. You see what I mean? It's not like we can short circuit it with a detective,
right.
But to be put in a good position to intervene.
Right. Yeah, and I don't necessarily.
Which is what I think we ended up with.
Yeah, I think so.
And that's where.
But
that's why I kind of think.
No, you go ahead, John. Sorry.
That's why I think it's if as long as there are kind of consequences either way, it's still that aesthetic choice of how much. So yeah, I agree with Alan that it's okay to have the detective work role just kind of figure out something in the middle, but then it still needs to kind of be. We still want something kind of actionable to change the path at that moment, even if it isn't the whole Megillah.
Right.
You can we get back to the pacing. You can kind of pace it into smaller pieces as long as each piece is like a real consequence, or like has a real effect on how you're thinking about how it it into the next situation.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like in the case of my game, like there could have been different paths that lead directly to Sargon's big mystical plan, but there were also paths that lead to who's doing what, who's undermining the operations of Lone Star's company. So that's kind of
There could have been one outcome would be to lead us into a conflict that would be a conflict and then reveal something.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I was also wondering whether the failure shouldn't be more immediately dramatic, right? Like, okay, success means we're in a good position to interrupt the summoning, but failure should mean
You're
possibly
The supervillains find you.
Yeah, you're kidnapped.
Right, somebody detects you and somebody flies into the window.
Right. Yeah, no, that's
or something.
yeah, and that's perfectly a good way to do it too. That's a very good idea actually. And I think that happened to Robbie actually in your to the spur in Alan's game when he went and snuck into.
Yeah, I think I was thinking. I can't remember the incidents, but I do remember thinking that I want to have something happen on a failure.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we? Did we do it? Are we done?
Covered an awful lot. I'm sure that other things.
That was a lot.
Okay. Well, we can.
I don't know if we solved everything, but we got
No, right. I don't think it's necessarily
I think we got
about
clearer. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it has to
We
be
got
about
clearer on the question.
solving so much as just trying to discuss what we're trying to improve. And again, it happens in terms of technique while we're playing, right? You're trying to reflect on different techniques that you can bring to the table to try to increase your options and increase your effectiveness. At least that's the way I see it. So that's what hopefully we've.
Maybe just being mindful of what your choice is, like, for example, a GM's choice of how much information is this detective work role is going to reveal.
Right.
Be aware of where that's going to take everything.
Right. And for that, in order to be aware, you have to have done it a couple of times, right, and seeing the consequences. So that's why I think it all comes back to bringing it to play and trying different things.
Yeah, it's not like once you've practiced one game, you have it mastered for every game that you change to.
Right.
So it's always a new adventure.
Yeah.
That's
That's true.
about it.
That's true. All right. Does anyone have any final words? John, you look like you got to get out of here.
No, I don't. I don't have any final words.
Okay.
On this, I don't have any particular go either, but no
All right.
final words at the moment.
All right.
I thought it was a fun discussion, and I appreciated hearing what everybody had to say about it.
Yeah, sure thing.
Given me a lot of
Definitely.
Food for thought. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks
I agree.
thanks
Thank you
everyone for showing up.
Together.
Sure thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you
All right.
guys. It was
Thanks, everybody.
good to
All
see
right.
you all again.
Good to see you too.
Likewise. Yeah.
All right. To other games. See y'all later.
Right.